Hi, I'm Marin Still, and last week I saw a jacket on a runway that cost $4,000. It had holes in it, deliberate holes. Artfully placed, carefully sized, professionally distressed holes. The model wearing it looked cold. She probably was cold. The jacket was designed to look like it could not keep anyone warm. It cost $4,000. And I could not stop thinking about the person who made the first jacket, 50,000 years ago, crouching in a cave, using a needle made from bone, stitching animal hide together with sinew pulled from a dead deer, hands probably bleeding, working by firelight, doing all of this because if they did not finish before winter, they would die. That person spent everything they had to make clothing that worked. The person on the runway spent $4,000 on clothing that did not. Hi, I'm Marin Still. And somewhere between those two people, something very strange happened to the entire human relationship with clothes. And once you see what that strange thing actually is, you cannot look at a fashion magazine, a luxury brand campaign, or your own wardrobe without seeing it everywhere. Stay with me. It gets weirder. Let's start at the beginning, the actual beginning. Because the story of why humans wear clothes at all is not the story most people think it is. The standard explanation is warmth. Humans lost most of their body hair roughly 2 to 3 million years ago as their ancestors moved from forest to open savanna, and clothing eventually compensated for that loss. The anthropologist Ian Gilligan at the University of Sydney has spent decades researching the origins of clothing and argues that thermal regulation was indeed the primary driver, but the timeline is more complicated than a simple cause and effect. The oldest direct evidence of clothing manufacture comes from needles found at sites like Denisova Cave in Siberia and Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to between 60 and 70,000 years ago. Needles, not just animal hides thrown over shoulders. Needles, meaning tailored, fitted, sewn garments. Which means 50,000 years before the first fashion week, someone sat down and decided that their clothing needed to fit. That matters, because fitting is not just functional. You can stay warm in a hide that is not fitted. You can survive winter in a blanket. The act of tailoring, of cutting and shaping and sewing so that the garment follows the body, is already something beyond pure survival. It is already the beginning of something else. The archaeologist Francesco De Rico at the University of Bordeaux, who studies early symbolic behavior in prehistoric humans, found pigment residues and shell beads at clothing-related sites, suggesting that very early garments were decorated. Not just functional, decorated. Someone was cold and also wanted to look a specific way while being cold. The desire to communicate something through what you wear appears to be as old as the desire to wear anything at all. Now let's talk about what was actually being communicated, because this is where it gets interesting. The anthropologist Terence Turner at Cornell University did a landmark study of the Kayapo people of Brazil, a community where very little clothing is worn in the Western sense, and found that what the Kayapo did wear, and how they wore it, and how they decorated their bodies, constituted an extraordinarily complex social communication system. Status, age, marital status, ritual role, all communicated through what was and was not on the body. The absence of covering was as loaded with meaning as the presence of it, which means clothing was never simply about covering the body. From the very beginning, it was about broadcasting information about the self to the group. And here is where the fashion industry enters the story, because what luxury fashion discovered, probably by accident, probably over centuries, is a very specific and very powerful signal, the signal of deliberate impracticality. Think about what a $4,000 distressed jacket actually communicates. It is not warm, it is not protective, it will not last as long as a cheaper, intact jacket. It is, by every functional measure, a worse piece of clothing than almost anything you could buy for $30. And that is precisely the point. The sociologist Thorstein Veblen described this mechanism in 1899 in his landmark work, The Theory of the Leisure Class. He called it conspicuous consumption, the deliberate display of wasteful expenditure as a signal of social status. The logic is brutal and simple. If you can afford to waste, you have surplus. If you have surplus, you are powerful. The waste is not a flaw in the signal. The waste is the signal. But here is the twist that connects the runway to the cave, because Veblen was describing a modern economic phenomenon. What he did not know, because the archaeological evidence was not yet available, was that the same signal had been running for 50,000 years before the first department store. The paleoanthropologist Randall White at New York University has documented extensive evidence of status display through deliberately impractical body adornment in Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe. Shells carried hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast, ivory beads that took days to carve from a single mammoth tusk, pigments and ochre applied to skin and clothing with no survival function whatsoever. These objects and practices cost enormous amounts of time and resources to produce. They were, in their prehistoric context, as impractical as a $4,000 distressed jacket. And that impracticality was the message. I have enough surplus, enough food, enough safety, enough status within the group, that I can afford to spend time making something beautiful and useless. Your ancestors were flexing. They were doing it with mammoth ivory beads instead of Balenciaga. But the mechanism was identical. Now let's talk about skin specifically, because the evolution of what counts as fashionable exposure is one of the most revealing stories in all of clothing history. For most of human prehistory, exposed skin was not a luxury signal. It was a survival risk. Cold, sunburn, injury, infection. Bare skin in a world without climate control and antibiotics was genuinely dangerous. The tailored, fitted garments your ancestors labored over were not modest choices. They were survival technology. So when did exposed skin become desirable? When did the revealing dress become a luxury item rather than a sign of poverty or danger? The historian Anne Hollander, in her influential work on the history of clothing, argues that the shift happened gradually as the practical threats of exposure diminished, as heating improved, as medicine advanced, as physical labor became associated with lower social status and physical leisure became associated with higher status. The tan from outdoor work became unfashionable in aristocratic Europe for exactly this reason. It signaled you worked outside, which meant you were not wealthy. The pale indoor skin that white lead paste was designed to achieve was the color of not having to be in the sun. And then, as that logic inverted in the 20th century, when outdoor leisure became a luxury and physical fitness became a status symbol, the calculus flipped completely. The tan became desirable. The visible athletic body became a status signal. The revealing garment became expensive rather than cheap. The fashion designer Coco Chanel is often credited with popularizing the tan in Western fashion in the 1920s. What she actually did was accelerate an existing status inversion. Exposure went from sign of poverty to sign of leisure. The body you revealed went from a sign of having nothing to cover it with to a sign of having the time and means to maintain it as something worth revealing. Which brings us to the runway, to the $4,000 jacket with holes, to the luxury brand selling what appears, at a glance, to be clothing that has fallen apart. What that jacket is selling is not warmth, not protection, not any functional property of clothing whatsoever. What it is selling is the signal that the person wearing it has so much surplus, so much financial safety, so much social status, so much removed from the actual survival concerns that made your ancestor bleed over a bone needle, that they can afford to wear something that does not protect them at all. It is the mammoth ivory bead. It is the shell carried 200 kilometers from the coast. It is the ochre painted on skin in a pattern that serves no survival function. It is the oldest status signal in human history wearing a new price tag. Your ancestor made clothing because they would die without it. You buy clothing that looks like it cannot do what clothing is supposed to do, because you are signaling that you are so far from dying that protection is irrelevant. The Stone Age and the runway are not opposites. They are the same conversation about the same thing: status, surplus. The ancient human need to communicate to the group exactly where you stand. The needle was made of bone. The price tag now has 4 zeros. But the person sewing and the person buying are running the same 50,000-year-old program. And the model on the runway, shivering in her deliberately inadequate jacket, is communicating exactly what your ancestor communicated with their carefully tailored hide. I have enough. I am enough. Look at me. Hi, I'm Marin Still. And now you can never unknow this.